Hey guys, today we are going to talk about inferences in social studies. So an inference, the technical term or the technical definition of it, it's a logical assumption made by considering two or more pieces of information and your previous knowledge. So basically what this means in layman's terms is that you read or you take in some information and then you use what you already know about the real world to come to a conclusion or to make a good educated guess. So for instance, a man with an umbrella. If a man comes in and let's say that he is soaking wet, he looks really mad and he's holding something that looks broken in his hand, more than likely he is really mad because his umbrella broke and that's why he's soaking wet. So we just take what we know about everyday life and we apply it to what we read and what we see. So maybe we don't know all the details, but our mind can fill in the gaps just based off the common sense and the common knowledge that we have. So whenever we make inferences, we use information that we have to develop new ideas about a subject. So maybe if I see somebody walk in camouflage, I use what I know. I use these new ideas about this person to think, oh, they're probably a hunter. And a lot of times we use inferences to connect people and events and ideas. For instance, we are in an election season, unfortunately. And so if you drive around Somerset, Kentucky, you can infer that most of the people in the city are probably Republicans, because if you see political signs, it is usually for the Republican candidates. So that is just an inference that you can make, and it connects the people of Pulaski County. It's like, okay, most people think this way. Most people are probably going to vote this way. So here's an example of an inference. This is soil can be put into different groups based on the characteristics of each type. Soils are categorized based on the size of their particles. Particle size affects how much water a soil can hold. Loam is soil that has mostly sand and silt, which allows water to filter quickly. It contains a smaller amount of clay, which holds water. Loam is often thought of as the best type of soil for growing crops. So they want to know, why is loam most likely the best type of soil? So they tell us in this passage, but they don't specifically say, this is what makes loam the best type of soil. We have to put two and two together and come up with the idea based off what we read. So our choices are, it contains more particles than silt soil, it enables enough water to reach the roots, or it can break down minerals. So if we look back, it says loam is soil that has mostly sand and silt, which allows water to filter quickly. So it contains more particles than silt soil. Sorry, my mistake. It's not that it contains more particles, so it's not like holding more particles of water, but what is happening is it enables enough water to reach the roots. So even though the particle size might be smaller, might be larger, so the particle size is what is allowing the water to get to the roots. So it doesn't have as much clay, so it doesn't hold as much water, so the water is getting through the soil to the roots. All right, let's look at this one. Winds whipped the window, fueling Emily's unease. There was no time to waste because she needed to get to the barn before the storm grew worse. The weather turned wilder, and threw branches into the side of the house. Emily gathered a few belongings and clutched them as close to herself as she could. A certain fear of failure, hollow and oppressive, came over Emily. That is when she thought about her mother's smile. The storm no longer was scary. So, which detail shows that Emily has willpower? A certain fear of failure came over her. Winds whipped the window, fueling Emily's unease. Or Emily gathered her belongings. So which of those is showing that she has willpower? So willpower is like, I'm not going to quit, I'm going to keep going. I'll do this until it's finished. She gathered her belongings. So she is scared, I mean, it says that, a certain fear of failure was oppressive over her, but she thought of her mom. The storm was no longer scary, but she's still doing that. So even though the fear of failure comes over her, even though the winds are whipping, those aren't necessarily saying she has willpower, but whenever she powered through that and gathered her stuff, it did. Earth's surface is always changing. Wind crumbles rocks and soil. Volcanoes erupt. Both of these things change the way Earth looks. Changes happen on Earth all of the time, and they occur in the ocean and on land. Underwater volcanoes add more land to our planet. Lava forms islands in the ocean. Based on the text, what can be inferred? Volcanoes are powerful. Changes only happen on Earth's surface. Or lava is the only thing that causes change on Earth. Well, I know lava isn't the only thing that causes changes. Tons of stuff can. Water, lots of things can. Changes only happen on Earth's surface? No, because the passage says they occur in the ocean and on land. So our answer has to be A, volcanoes are powerful. Now, sometimes in social studies, they might give you pictures, and you have to make inferences or guesses about those. So, for instance, here is a picture of a classroom. And so what could we infer? What's some information we get from this? For one, it looks like an older class. So this was years ago, maybe in the 1800s. And what are they learning about? They're learning about the Mayflower. They are learning about the Pilgrims that landed. So they are probably in social studies or history class, and that is what they are currently learning about. Now this one, what's going on in this picture? Right, you can see the auction written on that flag. You see that all the people standing on this stage are African American. So what's happening in this picture is that they are auctioning off slaves to be bought by the people that are kind of below the stage. Now let's look at this example. So take a minute, pause the video, and then we'll go over question 1 together. So what can we infer about the American public's feelings towards involvement in World War I during Wilson's first term? So they believed that we should support Britain's blockade. They supported Wilson's policy of neutrality. They were angered by Wilson's diplomatic approach. Or most Americans hoped that the U.S. would avenge the loss of ships. It's B. Because it talks about how, his slogan was, he kept us out of war. And despite the incidents, President Wilson worked to keep the U.S. out of the war. President Wilson aimed to keep us neutral. So yeah, people wanted this policy of neutrality. So if that was his slogan and people voted for him and he won, then more than likely people supported that. Now pause the video and read this passage about Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, and we'll go over that one too. Okay, so which of the following inferences can you make about Elizabeth Cady Stanton? So she's the woman they talked about at the beginning. She opposed the anti-slavery movement. She made speeches on women's suffrage. She worked for prison reform, or she had difficulty working with others. Now, letter A is one where they are trying to trick you because it says she opposed the anti-slavery movement. So sometimes we mix up the idea she opposed slavery or she was anti-slavery, but she didn't oppose the anti-slavery movement. That would mean that she was for slavery. So A is not our answer. B, she made speeches on women's suffrage. Maybe. C, she worked for prison reform. No, there's nothing about her working for prison reform. She had difficulty working with others. No, because it says whenever she met Susan B. Anthony, that they worked together to form the National Women's Suffrage Association. So our answer is B. Now look at number 3. What can you infer about women's suffrage in the U.S. before 1920? Women were prohibited from voting in any election. Only white women had the right to vote. Women in some states could vote for governor. Or women who were part of the suffrage movement could vote because of their political activism. So if we look at the bottom, women could vote in only 4 states in 1900, but they wanted a national constitutional amendment. So women could vote in 4 states, but that was it. So which of those goes along? Which of those is the right answer? So on this one, our answer has to be C. So it's not that only women could, so women who were part of the suffrage movement could vote because of their political activism. So just because you were part of the suffrage movement doesn't mean you were allowed to vote. Women were prohibited from voting in any election throughout the United States. Well, it says in 1900 they could vote in 4 states, so that isn't true. Only white women had the right to vote throughout the United States. Well, this doesn't say anything about white women, just women in general. So that means our answer has to be letter C. Alright, so same thing. Pause the video and I want you to read this table that's talking about the different leaders of the women's suffrage movement. Now, suffrage just means the right to vote. So this is just about the key women who fought for women's right to vote. So number 4 says, what information can you infer from the table? Many leaders who fought for women's rights supported African American rights. Men and women did not work together to expand rights in the U.S. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucy Stone never actually met. Were all supporters of women's suffrage were in the North after the Civil War. Now, there is nothing in there that says whether Stanton and Stone met or not, so it's not C. All supporters of women's suffrage were in the North. Does it say where these people were? It just says what they did, so it's not D. Men and women did not work together. That's not true because it said Stone worked with Frederick Douglass, so our answer has to be A. And we can see that many women, or many people who fought for women's rights also fought for African Americans for the right to vote. We see that when it talks about Lucy Stone. We see that when it talks about Lucretia Mott as well. And then number 5, what inference can you make about the voting records of these women's suffrage leaders? All of them were arrested for attempting to vote. Although they could not vote nationally, all of them could vote in their own states. The women only supported the right of white women to vote, or none of the women ever voted in a presidential election. It is D. And the reason we know this is that women didn't get the right to vote until 1920. And if we look at when all these women died, they all died before 1920. So they all died before they could vote for president. Alright, that is it for this video. I hope that this helped you understand some of the social studies material. So check for a self-check in the Google Classroom, practice on this, and hopefully we'll see you soon.